Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar and new faces in Lisbon for the IMISCOE Spring Conference. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome our opening speaker, Jonathan Darling, especially so as I have a deep appreciation for his work. So it's great to have you here, Jonathan. Jonathan Darling is an important voice on the politics of asylum and refuge and its relationship with the urban. His work on the urbanisation of asylum has advanced theory on the city as a means of managing and policing the lives of refugees, while simultaneously offering a political arena where migrants can make claims and forge acts of citizenship through a politics of presence. Also underpinning his work is his work on sanctuary cities and geographies of ethics, responsibility and care. He's also extensively researched the privatisation of accommodation for asylum seekers in the UK, offering an important critical lens on the impacts of austerity, urbanism and neoliberalisation and the social injustices that this has produced in the lives of asylum seekers. So currently Darling is Associate Professor at the University of Durham in the UK. He joined Durham in 2018. This followed a senior lectureship at the University of Manchester. Prior to this, he was a teaching fellow at St Andrews, at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He's published numerous articles in high-ranking journals, and his most recent book is on sanctuary cities and urban struggles, rescaling migration, citizenship and rights, and that was published by the University of Manchester Press just last year, I believe. So now I think it just remains for me to thank you, Jonathan, for coming to open the Spring Conference. It's an honour to have you here. And I think without further ado, I'll pass the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and also to everyone here for the invitation to join you for these few days and to spend some time in Lisbon at what is not the best time of year to live in the northeast of England weather-wise, so it's quite nice to get out of that, to be honest. What I want to do today is discuss some recent work I've developed over a number of years, exploring the UK asylum dispersal system. So dispersal is the process through which asylum seekers are distributed across the UK and housed during the period at which the state is deciding on their refugee status. So since 2012 really, I've been kind of working on a project examining how dispersal operates in 4 UK cities: Birmingham, Cardiff, Glasgow and Sunderland. And in particular I've been focusing on the privatisation of that accommodation and the ways in which we might see a reshaped urban governance around accommodation and support for asylum seekers. In the time I have today, then, I want to explore some of this work in relation to questions of privatisation, but also to open up some questions about violence and care in relation to that privatisation. And hopefully I think that will pick up on some of the themes that were outlined in the overall overview of this conference. So I want to start my presentation today then with 2 instances of not being heard. So the first of these comes from Glasgow. So this is an ethnographic account. I sit at a cafe talking with Anna, an asylum seeker originally from Eastern Europe, who's lived in Glasgow for 2 years. In discussing her housing conditions, she tells me, quote, "I've changed house 3 times because I always have problems, but you can't call the Scottish Gas or something. You need to call Orchard and Shipman. This Orchard and Shipman are doing nothing. You're calling, but maybe after 3 months they'll come and do some minor repairs." And then one day, water started to leak from the roof, and I started to call them. No one came along. So I moved my children to another room because I was worried they were living underneath the leak. One day, it collapsed. The roof just collapsed. They told me urgently, "Now you need to move." I couldn't choose where I got to go. They moved me to the other side of Glasgow, and I suffered there. I suffered because I had no idea where I was, and I had no idea who was around me. I was calling, have you repaired? Have you repaired? No, 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 no. After 5 months of me calling, they repaired the flat and I was very happy. They told me initially that I didn't need to take anything with me, I should leave my stuff. 6 months later, it was still not returned. So I decided I was going to take a taxi. I went there to get some of my stuff. I opened the door and what do I see? Someone else is living there and I've lost all my stuff. So, Anna's account of accommodation in Glasgow reflects many of what we might term the disciplinary attributes often associated with the dispersal system. The enforced mobility of being placed in Glasgow initially, the disruption of social networks of a move across the city without any choice, the frustrations of poor housing conditions and a lack of response to complaints. In this sense then, the poor treatment of Anna and her family, the conditions she endures and the danger she is placed in, form part of a repeated pattern of ill treatment for those seeking asylum in the UK. Anna's account is one of many, part of the story of asylum seekers accommodated as a means of regulation and control, but also subject to inadequate and at times unsafe housing conditions. What I wish to highlight today, though, is the persistent dismissal, the ignorance of Anna's claims to fair treatment, adequate conditions and safe housing. The second example that I want to open with comes from a connected but far removed world of parliamentary politics and procedural scrutiny. 25th of June 2013, the Boothroyd Room, Portcullis House, Westminster. Stephen Small, the Managing Director of Immigration Borders, the G4S, is giving evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee on the nature of his company's accommodation contract with the coalition government at the time. Pressed on concerns over the model of subcontracting used to provide accommodation, Small states, quote, "The one thing I want to say, and it's linked to the use of our supply chain and subcontractors, is one of the reasons we have that model is that the providers we use are experienced in operating in the asylum-seeking market. Whether intentional or not, the asylum-seeking market was born in British public discourse with these remarks. Of course, the process of making a market out of accommodation and support for asylum seekers didn't begin in 2013, nor should it be divorced from the much longer-standing development of profit-making from detention, detection and deportation of asylum seekers across Europe by companies such as G4S. Rather, what I want to foreground here is what is heard when a representative of a state-contracted security firm submits to Parliament those seeking sanctuary are now on market. It turns out that what is heard is surprisingly little, or rather, what is heard is surprisingly little of public concern. Why do I say this? Because these remarks generated no questioning, no censure, no protest, either in Westminster that day or in the media coverage or political debate at the time. The market in asylum accommodation slipped onto public record without so much as a second thought or backward glance. So I open with these two accounts then to foreground that the dispersal of asylum seekers is not just a matter of spatial distribution. It also conveys important messages about the distribution of social worth and the value of different lives. In this sense, dispersal represents a particular form of slow violence, to use Rob Nixon's phrase. And I see some exciting papers tomorrow that are utilising this lens as well, so I'm looking forward to that. The slow violence of dispersal operates differently, in the words of Anna and Stephen. But the confluence of the two exposes dispersal as a system of significant harm. In Anna's case, the slow violence of poor housing conditions and the dismissal of her complaints is cumulative, affecting a gradual undermining of a sense of self-worth, a slow wearing down of her ability to respond, to keep complaining. Yet this is a violence that's all too often erased from public concern, precisely because it is slow, unspectacular, and often hard to trace back to any single accountable actor. It's here that Stephen's statement matters, because the silence that met his remarks implied many aspects of this violence were accepted as given. Asylum accommodation had been privatised, in part because it could be. There was little controversial in this decision, as asylum seekers had become positioned as the latest group to be commodified in a drive for austerity-pleasing efficiency savings. As Nixon notes on slow violence, the recognition of harm is very often denied in such contexts, as those subject to that harm are not positioned as worthy of concern, positioned outside the ability to be seen as worthy of thought. Building on these two voices then, I want to make the case today that the outsourcing of asylum accommodation in the UK is a manifestation of a form of violence that's cumulative, incapacitating, and that governs the exhaustion of its critics and its subjects. In the UK, dispersal is rarely considered in the same lenses of violence as practices of detention or deportation. It rarely garners the same immediacy amongst advocates, activists and campaigners, and to be honest, some academics. And this is understandable in many ways, but it's a position that has been exploited by private accommodation providers and the government to maintain a system that places asylum seekers in unsafe housing. It fractures support networks and disconnects the issue of accommodation from the democratic accountability of local government. I'm going to go on to kind of unpack these claims in a moment. So, in this paper then I want to make three key points. First, that the privatisation and outsourcing of asylum accommodation and support has sought to detach asylum from public concern, ensuring that local authorities no longer have the capacity or the expertise to work with asylum seekers. Second, the cumulative cutting of support services in the third sector, together with increasing demands for that support, have ensured that exhaustion has become a common factor in regulating potential dissent or challenge. And third, that removal from public concern has produced a context of carelessness in which the effects of slow violence are reproduced and rarely considered worthy of comment or redress. So to develop these points then, I'm going to first outline the shifting dynamics of asylum accommodation in the UK briefly, and then I'm going to consider their effects for local authorities and third sector organisations. And then to conclude, I'm going to return to the experiences of Anna and others to consider how forms of carelessness intersect with these forms of violence. Okay, so in 2012, the UK government decided, as I mentioned previously, to transfer contracts for the provision of asylum seeker accommodation from a mixture of local authorities, social housing associations and small landlords to three private contractors. These were G4S, an international security company, Serco, and the accommodation partnership Clearer, now renamed Clear Screens. These contracts were collectively known as COMPASS, standing for the Commercial and Operating Managers Procuring Asylum Support. That's a term I have to say far too regularly for my own choosing. And the changes brought in through COMPASS were positioned as part of a drive to cut the budget of the UK border agency. So this was kind of positioned within a wider lens of austerity. So I want to consider some of the effects of this transition. The first and most significant effect was to transfer responsibility and, importantly, funding for the accommodation of asylum seekers away from local authorities, ensuring that they no longer have a role to play in supporting asylum seekers and affecting their knowledge base. For example, Laura, who worked for an asylum support organisation across the north of England, argued in an interview that, quote, in terms of COMPASS, we definitely lost council officials who were trained up in asylum issues. It's undeniable. I think generally across the council services, there's a lack of knowledge about asylum, but that's because they don't have any mandate to work with asylum seekers anymore. Similarly, Farah, who was a representative from the third sector organisation in Birmingham, noted that when local authorities were in contract, so doing accommodation and support, they had a vested interest in it, and the money from that contract would go back into support services. What's happened now is they're not in contract. They've had to cut money to voluntary sector agencies and others, and demand is going up, but you've got a private organisation that doesn't appear to be listening. In both these accounts then, Laura and Farah highlight distinctions in investment, knowledge and capacity that marks a transition from a mixed provision of accommodation between local authorities to the private accommodation of COMPASS. This shift not only gave contracts to private contractors, but it meant the end of public provision. This reshaped the relationship local authorities have with asylum seekers. With no obligations to provide accommodation and no financial support to maintain asylum expertise, those who formerly worked in that sector were either transferred to new roles or sought employment elsewhere. The effects of this transition were discussed by David, a caseworker for a national refugee organisation. He said, some of those members may have transferred over to the private sector, so actually the local authorities lost its memory, because the memory is sat with individuals. I've been to Home Office meetings where they presented something and we've said this is very similar to what you presented 4 years ago, and they're surprised because they think it's a new idea. That happens quite a lot, and I think you see the same with local authorities. They start out knowing so much, and then a lot of the specialist teams for asylum, while they were being housed, those individuals have moved on. As David recounts, this loss of institutional memory from local authorities was not only of the asylum system and its varied legal complexities and distinctions, but it was also a loss of memory about the local context, about community relations, and about experiments that have been that made dispersal function more or less effectively in the past. With such memory lost, the ability to reflect on past mistakes, to contextualise new policy approaches, and crucially to historicise what may or may not work in particular contexts was dramatically reduced. The second effect then was a wider fiscal impact of Compass. So the first effect is this kind of hollowing out of knowledge and memory from the local state. The second was the way in which it had knock-on effects for third sector organisations and charities. So Sarah, who's a policy coordinator in Glasgow, highlighted that one of the big effects of that has been that there was more money coming into Glasgow when Glasgow City Council provided services. They provided wraparound services that were factored into their calculations. What a private company would see as profit, local authorities were able to reinvest. So in this Glasgow context, when the local authority held contracts to provide accommodation, funding was able at times to be used to support wider services. In this way, things like language training, drop-in support, integration networks and so on were maintained, often highly precariously, but maintained nonetheless. Compass meant not just a loss of control and capacity for local authorities, but a removal of support for third sector organisations and groups. Within dispersal cities like Sunderland, that historically had a small but committed refugee support sector, funding cuts have led to the closure and dramatically reduced capacity to provide support to asylum seekers. So there's a real kind of geographical disparity in the way that these changes are having an effect. Third then, the effects of change for local authorities and the third sector are exacerbated when we consider the model of subcontracting that's being used here. As Warren, an asylum advocate from Birmingham, argues, the centralised contracts provided by the Home Office mask a much more fractured reality. So he says, G4S will have a contract and then they'll subcontract to someone else, who may then subcontract to someone else. So for the service users and the agencies trying to help and resolve things, it's impossible to ever find out who's going to take responsibility for something. The service user will say, I don't know, I haven't got any hot water. And they'll tell that to the guy who comes to see them once a week. And he'll say, it's nothing to do with me, you need to speak to G4S. They'll phone G4S. They'll say, no, you need to speak to the guy who comes to see you each week. There's this endless deferral of responsibility. Simple things can go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. The deferral of responsibility that Warren recounts here refers back to Anna's experiences of being ignored, not opened. The disengagement of local authorities who no longer have any ties to asylum accommodation meant that the space for dealing with complaints or issues was evacuated. It was left solely to private providers and the Home Office to negotiate. Whilst often time-poor third sector organisations like Warren's had their resources diverted into chasing complaints on the behalf of asylum seekers. So someone like Warren, who's a highly trained legal advocate, is spending half of his week dealing with broken boilers rather than advancing advocacy or legal work. Taken together then, the Compass transition saw the removal of local authorities from direct engagement with asylum and passed a range of demands on to third sector groups who struggled to negotiate housing complaints on behalf of asylum seekers. The cumulative impact of the loss of knowledge and expertise noted above, together with the demands on time, was summarised by Sarah, who works for a third sector organisation in the North East. In our experience, even the things that they're duty bound to provide, like adaptations for people who are disabled or proper interpreting, things like washing machines and so on, they're just not doing. And we know that people don't feel strong enough to complain. So it makes day-to-day living even more distressing and even more difficult. So this transition through Compass saw not only a declining role for the local state, but also served to disrupt the grounds for dissent and challenge by asylum advocacy groups and charities. Faced with the demand to improve immediate housing standards, as Warren was here, the capacity to more critically and strategically push back against privatisation became ever harder to manage. Third sector groups increasingly had to adapt to conditions in which their own existence was under threat. It is of course worth noting that the exclusions of dispersal did not begin with privatisation in 2012. However, the articulation of asylum as a market and the removal of asylum accommodation from local authorities has served to increasingly obscure the violence of dispersal in chains of responsibility. By removing accommodation from public control and removing asylum seekers from social housing, Compass would serve to further distinguish and differentiate asylum from other areas of social care and social concern. The impact has been that asylum seekers no longer factor into debates over the demise of social housing in the UK. They're instead positioned as tenants of a private system with its own demands, expectations and standards. This division is a critical tool in disrupting attempts to ground wider arguments around rights to housing across boundaries of immigration status. It undermines broader forms of housing activism and advocacy. In part, this is because housing, certainly in its social and public form, represents an example of what Bonnie Honey has termed a public thing. For her, public things are core elements of democratic life. Public things press us into relations with others. They are sites of attachment and meaning that occasionally inaugurations, conflicts and contestations underwrite everyday citizenships and democratic sovereignties. In this way, public things gather people together, materially and symbolically. And in relation to them, diverse peoples may come to see and experience themselves, even if just momentarily, as a common in relation to a commons, a collected, if not a collective. It's this commoning and this kind of connection across differences of status and differences of tenure potentially that Compass and the privatisation process effectively undermines. Not in an idealistic sense that would assert that there was a commoning previously within dispersal, but rather in the potential for a collective sense of needs or responsibilities to emerge. You're undercutting the ability for that connection to emerge. It's this sense of disrupting a public concern for asylum that the privatisation of asylum affects. Not just in terms of funds, knowledge and expertise, but in the perception of potentially common causes and concerns. So I want to move on to consider briefly the effects of these shifts for people within the asylum system. And I want to do that, and then I'll return back to the points I was making through Anna at the start of the paper. But whilst it's true to suggest that accommodation and support provided under previous models of dispersal through local authorities were far from adequate or well supported, we've seen a rise in what we might think of as carelessness since privatisation. And here I mean carelessness in two senses. Firstly, in a common sense, it's something that's neglectful and lacking in care. But also, in a second sense, it's something that's absent-minded and inattentive. In the context of accommodation and support that used to be linked to public obligations of social care, carelessness is a manifestation of the violence of dispersal, as care is slowly eroded from the asylum system. And I want to outline two brief examples. So, first, in March 2015, I met David, an asylum seeker living in Sunderland. David was accommodated along the street from a pub that was known as English Defence League meeting room. The English Defence League is a kind of far-right racist organisation within the UK. As a result, he described having to take what he termed the back route home in order to avoid walking outside the pub. The house he lived in was isolated and he wasn't aware of any other asylum seeker accommodation in the area. "We stand out," he said, of his race in a predominantly white community. The house had been subject to a number of attacks. The back fence had been hit with bricks and bananas had been thrown into the garden and across the back gate. When I asked David why he thought people were sent to Sunderland, he said, quote, "It's cheaper to send people here. They just put people in housing and leave them there. They don't care about people's health or mental needs." Within the stress of the asylum system, David felt he had a limited future. Quote, "I struggle with the idea of having to adapt to it. I just don't want to have to adapt to this." The second example comes from January 2016, when the issue of asylum seeker accommodation made national headlines in the UK. Following revelations that houses used to accommodate asylum seekers in the city of Middlesbrough were identifiable by their red front doors. The doors had been painted by an accommodation contractor, Jomas, to help identify their properties for the purposes of monitoring, maintenance and inspection. The red doors mark the residents of asylum seekers out from their neighbours, and this identification served to expose the habits of these properties to racism, harassment and vandalism. The outcome of the brief media attention, which lasted for about a week, was a Home Office inquiry into the accommodation involved and the repainting of the doors. In both of these cases, questions are raised around the allocation of housing, the extent to which appropriate housing has been found, and the actions of private contractors in managing that housing. For David, being housed so close to a far-right meeting point was extremely damaging, especially in the context of relatively few dispersals in Sunderland, a city in one of the UK's least diverse regions. As he puts it, he and his housemates stood out in this context. Similarly, the decision to paint the doors of properties in Middlesbrough red served as an inadvertent targeting mechanism. In the subsequent inquiry, it was found that this decision had been taken by the housing contractor in order to speed up the process of property checking and monitoring, thereby increasing potential efficiency gains on housing contracts. In both these cases, these are actions, I would argue, of carelessness. They're careless in a lack of consideration for their actions, but they're also careless in the neglect of the safety and security of asylum seekers that they expose. What's not intentional, I have no evidence to suggest that they were intentionally fostering racism and harassment here. The consequences reproduce the slow violence of an uncaring state and produce eruptive moments of harassment and distress within a wider horizon of harm. Importantly, these forms of carelessness emerge in part through the removal of asylum from public concern and public oversight that I mentioned previously. With privatisation, we see the loss of knowledge and expertise from local authorities, as I've already outlined. And one of the key things to go within this process was the experience of how dispersal can be made more or less harmful. What has been tried and found wanting in the past. This knowledge, situated and contextual as it is, has been lost to today's private providers, if indeed they're even interested in it. It's this knowledge which may have intervened to recognise the dangers of red doors or of particular streets in Sunderland. The detachment of these decisions in the context of dispersal as a local concern, centred on the cultural histories and micropolitics of place and neighbourhood, is one means through which the avoidance of possible harm is lost in this way. Okay. So, I've tried through the time that I've had today to argue that through the privatisations of the last decade, various forms of kind of harm, violence, care, carelessness, endurance has become a part of the process of governing asylum support for the UK. In focusing on the slow violence of asylum accommodation support, I argue that the exhaustion of asylum seekers should not be viewed as simply a defining feature of this system, but rather should be seen as a technique of governing itself. So here I'm talking about the exhaustion and endurance that is required both of David and of Anna to live through these conditions and experiences, but also of people like Warren and Sarah, who try to constantly navigate and make these claims and complaints in a context of progressive funding cuts and a lack of knowledge and expertise from the state around. The exhaustion of complaints, the wearing out of bodies, the decaying of buildings, the racist abuse called across red doors, and the bodies growing cold due to broken boilers. All of these conditions are part of the ways in which asylum dispersal manages the lives of asylum seekers. All of these conditions exhaust asylum seekers and migrants, and they're endured by bodies positioned as unwanted by the state. And all of these conditions pass largely unspoken and unseen within policy discussions and political processes in the UK. It's this confluence of slow violence that continues to produce a system in which asylum seekers risk social isolation and marginality. But really importantly, this system survives. It's survived multiple shortcomings, it's survived various forms of political censure. It's persisted as a policy platform relatively unchallenged for 17 years, and in that time it's become progressively more determined, more punitive, and more poorly funded. Dispersal presents a policy landscape of persistent instability, and as Anna's experiences suggest, this has particularly punitive effects for people trapped within it. And here I'm drawn to the work of cultural theorist Elizabeth Bovenelli, and particularly her account of the way in which dissent is managed and controlled through positions of exhaustion. So she says that when we think of alternative political social projects in kind of privatising neoliberal worlds, an authorless wager is made that very few people will be able to continue to persevere in the face of prevailing material obstacles. They'll not be able to sustain their perseverance. So the major wager is made to wait until an alternative project exhausts itself. It's in the wearing down of individuals then that power is exercised. In this context, the demand to struggle for alternative social worlds, to act politically, may be too much for many to bear. The cumulative exhaustion serves to insulate the harm that asylum dispersal has done to those caught within it. In this way, Bovenelli alerts us to two things that I think are important for thinking about the debates around housing and its various forms of exclusion. First is how everyday forms of suffering operate as part of the management of forms of dissent. It's hard to continually dissent and challenge. And the second is the significance of everyday harm and suffering in shaping how lives are valued. This comes to the fore if we continue to look back to Anna's experiences. So after she's recounted the collapsing of her ceiling, she begins to talk about how hard it is to try and challenge this. She says, "You need to push. I'm really so tired. How can I keep my nervous system calm? I don't know. That's why I really regret my children seeing me like this. My health is everything because I need to look after my children. But I start to drink medicines and my children suffer for this. From looking at their mum every time like this, it's very stressful. I don't have words how to say how stressful it is." In these conditions, Anna's endurance, her ability to keep pushing to maintain and seek better accommodation for her and her family is an act of endurance, but it's an endurance as a political gesture, as an active accomplishment. The conditions of precarity faced by asylum seekers dispersed across British cities suggest not that striving for rights, resources and recognition is misguided or illusionary, but rather that the hope of this must be tempered by the labour of enduring the present, enduring a situation like Anna's or David's. So, in concluding, I want to think about some ways that we can consider alternatives. So, if the current system and its private operations seeks to govern through exhaustion in different ways, it's important to suggest that that governing requires constant work. And it requires constant work to keep forms of suffering from galvanising alternatives, from drawing attention to ignored injustices. And this is never an entirely successful project. Points of disruption and critique can be discerned in the midst of that system. Most notably, these come through the activism of asylum seekers who put together housing biographies that expose the conditions they endure, in the collective monitoring of accommodation providers, and in the work of advocates who weave these narratives together to form unremitting evidence of the harms produced through privatisation and dispersal. So, for example, one of the things that has emerged in Glasgow has been a process of collective monitoring and checking of accommodation by asylum seekers in relationship with a series of third sector organisations to try and at least maintain minimum forms of standards. This is a minor politics. It's very much not kind of radically changing the system, but attempting to ensure that the experiences of someone like Anna are not regularly repeated. Or secondly, we might think about in the context of Northern Ireland, the work of the Northern Ireland community of refugees and asylum seekers who've done significant forms of their own research, drawing on skills as journalists, as activists, to produce a series of policy-orientated papers reporting on asylum and housing conditions. And these forms of work are important for two reasons. Firstly, because of the types of redress that they can pose and the way that they may have policy effects. And secondly, because of the ways that they bind people together in the act of producing forms of research and forms of collective caring. They convey a message that people like Anna's stories matter to one another and should matter to wider publics. Trying to push back against the sense that asylum is no longer a public concern in this way. So where do we go from here? In part, that's a consideration for me to think about in terms of my own work and writing. So I welcome the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you today. But I think there's a need to focus on two sides of political response. And I don't have an answer to either of these necessarily. So first, I think there's a need to think about how forms of care that call attention to suffering and that challenge the ways in which it often passes unseen might be articulated. Those forms of care need to be historicised and obviously located within the cultural context of different forms of dispersal. But there needs to be an attempt to push back against the sense that the state and society can get away with no longer caring. And second, I think there needs to be an effort to place asylum accommodation and its exclusions alongside a wider range of public concerns and public debates, which is again one of the reasons why I'm particularly happy that we're having this focus in this conference. Critique, I think, will only be truly effective when asylum accommodation is understood as a part of a wider political and moral argument that refocuses on a need for care with and solidarity alongside those whose lives are being shaped by the effects of austerity, the denial of the right to housing, and increasing welfare restrictions and stigmatisation. To divide off these debates seems to me to be problematic, but also to reproduce those very forms of distinction and division that were being articulated through Stephen's account of the asylum-seeking market as something that is distinct from social housing or other forms of austerity and welfare. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jonathan, for a very challenging and thought-provoking opening lecture. We have 20 minutes for debate, so I'm sure that you have comments and questions. So if you have a microphone, do you have a microphone? Yes, right. So we can open the floor. Maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions at a time. question from here.
Thanks very much for a really provocative paper, which is both analytically rich but also brings us back to what should we do about it, which is really refreshing. I think a couple of things. One of them is the extent to which the issue of housing is something which is shared with people who would have been in social housing, and the extent to which this is part of the how Britain has changed its relationship to land and housing markets. So there's something here about the commonalities based around various class positions which go beyond the question of asylum. The other point that I wanted to sort of raise, and both of them are just things that I welcome your reflections on, is this carelessness, or is this about shifting care from one object to the other object? So you look after the people who have to go and review other people's houses, and that's who you care for. So you're actually shifting what it is that you care for. So.
Thank you for the mic, and thank you for the presentation, Jonathan. I have a question about the impulse or the starting point of this privatisation process. So what started this, and have you encountered any cities that also chose a different path? So was there some room for manoeuvre on the local level also to handle things differently?
Maybe we can gather one more question. No, maybe then.
Yeah.
Answer.
Okay. So on the first of the questions, I think that question around dynamics of class and the intersection of that with those housing processes, I think that's kind of a fundamental site where we see the distinction and division happening. And I think that's where there's, in some ways, there's most ground to be navigated, but also most ground that is very tricky to navigate in terms of thinking about how you actually articulate an argument that tries to not reproduce forms of distinction and narratives of competition, effectively, resource competition. Particularly, I think, because that's where we've seen this process of kind of hiving off most effective. So, for example, one of the parallels might be in 1999, the way in which asylum support and welfare was taken out of the standard welfare system and kind of created its own system of National Asylum Support Service, in part as a means to basically distinguish this and to partly criminalise and deter, but also as a mechanism of making that a cheaper process in some ways. So I think those kinds of distinctions become very, very strongly ingrained, particularly where we have dispersal to areas that are predominantly of low socio-economic employment and often kind of areas of existing social disadvantage. But there are examples where those things have been challenged and pushed back on. So, for example, some of the most successful dispersal anti-deportation work that's happened in Glasgow has been around where communities have tried to identify forms of solidarity about kind of poor quality housing, and particularly in cases where you see people effectively paying exorbitant rents for very poor housing alongside people in the asylum system who they recognise do not have a choice within that process. So I think there are kind of possibilities there, but I think they're very hard to actually articulate because they swim against a much more significant tide in terms of those questions about resources and competition. But that's also why I would argue that the discussion about asylum housing and privatisation should not be had outside of a kind of wider narrative about the demise of social housing and questions about the sort of the wider relation between what responsibilities the state should be performing and the ways in which that connects up with questions about what it means to be a citizen or a non-citizen in contemporary UK. There's this really powerful example that I didn't have time to talk about today, where Birmingham City Council, when they did, announced that they were going to move from being part of the wider local authority situation to a sort of privatised system, described this in a very aggressive, quite punitive language, saying that we want to, quote, support our people. That Birmingham has too many indigenous, homeless, and we want to support our people. And what I found quite powerful in some of the responses of activists, but also asylum seekers in Birmingham, talking to them about this experience, was their argument of, we are your people. Like, you just have to think about that relation to people within your city differently. And so I think there are kind of ways in which we can kind of think through those things distinctly. In terms of the shifting care from object to object, I think that's interesting. I think I kind of, I suppose I was thinking through carelessness because I wanted to get at the sense that, you know, the red doors thing, I don't think was an intentional decision from this person. I think it was kind of more cock-up and conspiracy to think of it in those terms. But I think it was led to by a series of steps. And one of those steps may have been that kind of sense that we're transferring that process of care from the care for the individual to the care for the worker or the wider process. So I think it's an interesting idea. Thanks for that. And on privatisation, are there different paths or routes to manoeuvre? So there were different responses from different cities across the UK. So some were very resistant to privatisation. Some said, you know, we want to continue to do this and we can do this better than G4S. And others kind of embraced it effectively and viewed this as a way to get out of something that they weren't terribly comfortable with in the first place. Birmingham being one example of that. But the problem is that they have no real room for manoeuvre or indeed kind of argument, because it's a highly centralised governmental system in which the Home Office decide they're going to do this and it is then imposed effectively. So Glasgow City Council actually bid for the same contracts that G4S and others initially got. But at the time, the contracting was decided purely on the basis of the lowest cost contract. So they were massively undercut by about 2 million by G4S to do this work. So that was the decision-making process. In terms of the longer history, the official argument for it was efficiency, the classic neoliberal argument, but also austerity, that it was a way to cut the amount of money it was going to cost to house asylum seekers. But there is also a longer history here, in that dispersal started in 2000, and over that time period, some local authorities were very supportive, others less so. There were a series of kind of ups and downs. But what we started to see was like a slowly gradual diminishment of support for dispersal from local authorities. So initially they were quite supportive because it was a way to basically use hard-to-let social housing that you couldn't do anything else with to provide accommodation and get a guaranteed income for. But then over time, the money basically was cut and they became less involved. So those councils that were still supported by the end were those with, I would argue, the sort of strongest kind of sense of civic duty, responsibility, how we define it.
I think we have another question over here. Maybe you can just introduce yourself.
Ella Munchen from Stockholm University. covered wristbands and red doors. I wasn't aware about that system before, and it brings to mind uncanny memories of times that weren't applied into place in the past. So I'm wondering, how is it possible? How is it enforced? And were there any local voices against the system?
Thank you.
Perhaps we could collect another question.
So there were local responses. I think what's kind of significant about the wristbands was an example from Cardiff where sometimes who were in an initial accommodation centre there, which was where people were placed before being dispersed, were all provided with wristbands to indicate that they had access to food because there was a kind of canteen at this place. Various parts of the press drew parallels with all-inclusive holidays as a mechanism of sort of talking about the generosity of the British state in relation to this. So there were local voices of opposition in both contexts, and in both contexts the reason why these came into the press, and in the Red Doors case came to be focused on by the Home Affairs Committee, was because local groups started to kind of galvanise and to argue with media and so on. But it's important to note that kind of media focus only emerged after several months of that work of like highlighting these things and trying to get attention, because there was a concern that it just wasn't important enough, or it wasn't kind of garnering sufficient focus. So I think that comes to this question of, the wider narrative of public concern. To what extent actually is this something that is worthy of attention? And I think that is definitely a consideration within the press, and also I think within local authorities as well. So one of the things that comes out in a place like Sunderland, which is a much smaller dispersal context than somewhere like Birmingham or Glasgow, is that there are local authority representatives who did not even know that people were being dispersed to their city. And there are also representatives who are very happy to not know, or to not have any kind of knowledge or understanding of those kind of things. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about this sense that this is something that gets hived off from public concern and consideration. So there are forms of local opposition, but again, they're kind of running against larger, more established, I suppose, narratives.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think we have another question here. Yeah. If you can introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Durham University. Earlier we were talking about, so in the same room, I don't know if you were there already, about how to translate your findings into policy advice. And so of course this policy was introduced in order to cut costs and to reduce, and also to sort of feed in, to respond to process against the arrival of the reception of asylum seekers, and maybe also to deter people away from, go to Germany instead of England, that sort of rhetoric. So what would you, if you would have to translate your outcomes into policies, what would your advice to policymakers be?
I probably wouldn't talk about Elizabeth Povinelli and exhaustion to policymakers. I think that would be my first port of call. In terms of policy advice, it's an interesting question. So I think there are two potential responses to this. So on the one hand, there's a response which is whether you are trying to advise on how to make a violent system a bit less violent and to kind of reduce the forms of harm that go on with that. So the question is, do you engage in policy in an effort to shift away from all of the violences of dispersal and forms of privatisation and so on. In which case, if you're doing that, I think you argue that what you need is a fundamental rethink of this whole process and system, involving offering different forms of accommodation, offering ways that choice can be reintroduced within a compulsory dispersal model in various ways, and basically bringing local authorities much more fully back into this. So one of the arguments in the UK more recently has been that the Syrian vulnerable persons resettlement scheme, which is run through local authorities, whilst far from perfect, has a much more strong engagement with communities and these sort of things. So looking at those sorts of models and thinking about how they can be more effective. If you're from a slightly more realistic position, thinking privatisation is probably here to stay for some time, which unfortunately looks like in reality with the recent election result in the UK certainly, then you try to think, well, what are the kind of minor wins that can be articulated around this? One of those I would suggest is the need for much more effective communication between those involved. So local authorities who don't even know how many asylum seekers are within their area, effectively. And they still have responsibilities for things like education and healthcare and other elements of the wider experience of being dispersed somewhere, but they're not given details about how many people are arriving, etc., etc. So improving those forms of communication, having proper forms of censure for private providers to make sure that they actually are doing the things that they are being paid for, effectively. Those kind of elements, I would suggest, are the key things. The one thing I would say is that the period that this research was focused on was the kind of first phase of privatisation. So this round of contracts ended in 2019, so at the end of 2019, the process of privatising accommodation was re-tendered, basically. So they went back to the market, re-tendered, largely with exactly the same result. There was a difference in one provider. But in that process of re-tendering, the Home Office learned from its previous mistakes and did a widespread consultative process. So they asked all manner of different people what their policy advice would be. I was one of those people. Not because I'm particularly important, but just, I think they're just going down the list. But also, third sector organisations, local authorities, a whole range of different people. And by and large, that advice was completely ignored, as you might expect. So this kind of question about how consultative that process really is, and whether consultation is actually a kind of participatory sort of smokescreen, I think is important to consider. Thanks.
We're nearly at the end of the session, but we have time for one quick question if anybody. Yeah, over here, please.
Gina Belloni from the University of Trento. I was just wondering how much time, more or less, these people spent in this kind of accommodation. And, one question would be, what's the life after this kind of accommodation? Have you had the chance to see, like, how do they proceed in their housing lives, let's say, trajectories? And the other one, have you come across any case, like positive case? But positive case of, they ended up in a good neighborhood and they had a good relationship with the neighbors, or also they managed to make these houses that were bad at first, good houses, maybe places where they could feel at home.
Great, thank you. It's always nice to end on positivism. Well, not positivism, positivity. Time accommodation. So time accommodation predominantly is dependent on how long you're in the asylum system for. So in theory, the Home Office claims that they want to make all asylum decisions in the UK within 6 months of the initial interview. That very, very rarely happens. So most people will be in some form of dispersed accommodation somewhere between probably 1 to 3 years, depending on their kind of individual circumstances. Often that will not be an unbroken period within one form of accommodation. So someone like G4S or Serco have a contract to provide accommodation within a particular region. What that means is that the Home Office basically give them freedom to decide how they do that. So if you're dispersed to Serco accommodation in Scotland, it's up to Serco to decide whether you're going to be in Glasgow or not. And often what happens is people are moved between different parts of that region to fall into a whole variety of different reasons, often around procurement of different property types and so on. So there's quite a bit of movement. It's rare that people stay within the same individual accommodation for that entire time, and relatively rare that people stay in the same place actually. There's quite a bit of movement between different parts. What happens afterwards? So if you are successful in your asylum claim and you get refugee status in the UK, that is for an initial period of 5 years. It can be reviewed at any time after that 5-year period, within that 5-year period. You have 28 days to leave that accommodation and your support is finished at 28 days. So if you're successful, that means that you basically go into local authority, you kind of fall under the books of local authority homelessness legislation. So a large number of people will either go into hostels or other forms of emergency accommodation, which is again a kind of pinch point in that system. Often because those hostels are quite overcrowded, but also you have a whole variety of alcohol and drug dependency issues within those hostels. So there's a kind of wider sort of element there. If you are unsuccessful, then within 28 days you are either detained with the expectation of deportation, potentially with appeals, or you are forced to leave your accommodation but have nowhere to go, basically. The UK state uses destitution as a policy tool to basically force people out of the country of their own accord. In Scotland, in Glasgow, there's been a quite high-profile case recently of Serco, the provider, changing the locks on accommodation to forcibly remove people at the end of that process as a means of eviction. So it was quite high profile, they were taken to court, and quite recently the High Court backed Serco in changing the locks on accommodation to force people onto the streets effectively. Positivity. There are positive examples. I think one of the ironies of this system is that dispersal is ideally was put in place to avoid the concentration of people in London and the South East based on their social networks and potential employment prospects. The irony, of course, is that dispersal isn't really dispersal across the whole country. It's to areas of low-cost housing, predominantly in the north of England, Scotland and Wales. So one of the arguments that's been made is to make dispersal properly nationwide and to think about how you can disperse into a whole variety of different types of communities. But there are positive examples, like somewhere like Glasgow has had significant problems, but has also done a massive amount in terms of forms of integration support and kind of solidarity between different communities, such that a larger proportion of asylum seekers who receive refugee status stay in that city than any other dispersal area, because they have various forms of networks and connections. There's a widespread integration network that has been established there to try and help foster forms of integration and these kind of things. And also, in the context of devolution, the Scottish and the Welsh government tend to be much more progressive and supportive around questions of immigration and asylum than Westminster does. There's a limit to what they're able to do under those powers, but it does mean that you do have slightly higher levels of funding for support networks in those contexts. So there are positive examples. They're just kind of scattered. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions and for your presentation, Jonathan. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the session, so I'd just like to thank you again for such a proactive and thought-provoking presentation. I think you'll agree with me that Jonathan's brought to the fore very important questions that will really set in motion a fruitful debate throughout the conference. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.